Josh Clark. I'm the head of North American markets for Clearsulting. Today, I'm joined by my colleague, Mike Pawlikowski, who's our close and consolidations lead. We're going to do a webinar today on redefining the CFO playbook for 2026. But before we jump into that, we know there might be some people that are joining this webinar that haven't worked with Clearsulting before. So we'll just do a brief overview of our firm, and then we'll jump into the webinar. So who's Clearsulting? Clearsulting is a management consulting firm that focuses exclusively on the Office of Finance. Our strategy has been to build depth in specialism in the specific domains within the finance function versus a generalist consulting firm. In terms of what we do, we advise clients on finance strategy, how to approach process design, operating model, transformation roadmaps, things like that. We also implement digital finance technologies across the office of the CFO. When those digital technologies are implemented, we also help optimize or manage those long-term. And then, of course, we innovate. Things like webinars today, thought leadership, white papers, things like that that are relevant to CFOs and finance leaders across the world. In terms of our domains, you can see there on the right, we help across the Office of Finance, anything from record to report, source to pay, invoice to cash, FP&A, treasury, and functions like that, we support. Basically, the only things that we don't do are tax or external audit. In terms of companies that we work with, we've got over 600 clients under our belt, including 60% of the Fortune 10. So whether you're from a smaller company or a bigger company, or from the manufacturing, oil and gas, technology, financial services, we've worked with all of those types of companies, so the discussion will be relevant to you for joining today. So that's about us. Let's talk about the webinar today. So let's dive in. If you're a CFO or a finance leader, you're likely navigating three simultaneous pressures today. There's focus on margin and cost. There's increased expectations around risk, governance, and controls. And if you're on LinkedIn or on Twitter or X or just out there on social media, you're getting a steady drumbeat of messaging about how you should deploy AI within a finance function. So our goal today is not to amplify the noise around AI, it's to actually talk about a pragmatic playbook for the CFO and how to approach that in 2026. We know some of you might just be focusing on process transformation today, restructuring your close, getting better at FP&A. We know some of you also might be piloting or heavily deploying AI, and others might be somewhere in between. The real risk in 2026 isn't being early or late with AI. It's about sequencing your finance transformation incorrectly. So we're going to talk through that today across 5 main topics. The first, we're going to talk about what is the shift from financial steward to strategic CFO really look like in practice? And is that any different in 2026 than it was a few years ago? Then we'll dive into the priorities finance leaders should focus on in 2026. We'll talk about where digital finance, automation, and AI are delivering real outcomes today and where you should be cautious. We'll talk about how CFOs and finance leaders can lead transformation with clarity, empathy, and the right communication. And then we'll give some real lessons learned from finance transformation projects that we've worked on recently. What worked, what didn't, and what leaders should do differently. All right, so Michael, before we dive in, there's a lot of AI buzz in the market right now. How do you think finance leaders should be grounded in this conversation?
I think, and we'll hit on this throughout today, there's a way to look at this from it's called a work product perspective, that's kind of resulted in work product falling into what I would call one of 3 categories. And I know Josh later on today will talk about some of the stats from a recent project we did, but the first is really sitting in rules-based automation, which I think when we look at the last 5 to 10 years, you group on this line will think about things like RPA, ETL, and these are things that really have deterministic logic. So if I do X, Y happens. If Y happens, A is the result. And those types of use cases still are relevant in an AI, let's say future. And they need to be solved with pragmatic, real solutions that have the right level of auditability and controls, which we'll talk about a bit today. The second is AI, or what we would call inference-based systems. So they look at or infer patterns from data. They can generate predictions, classify information, deploy or generate narratives. And what I hope the group gets from today is we'll talk about what some of those use cases look like across the finance suite, to kind of give you an idea of what we're seeing with organizations we work with. And then the third is, human accountable work. I think at the end of the day, there's a lot of buzz. I know Josh, you hit on this earlier, that AI is going to replace work, that human in the loop might not be required at some point. But I think from our point of view, there's still a place, and there'll always be a place when we think about final approvals, discussions and decisions around risk tolerance and risk acceptance, professional judgment, et cetera. And technology certainly is going to assist in that as we think about how AI plays here in the next 12 to 24 months. But I don't think accountability moves off the plate of the CFO, CAO, and other finance leaders within organizations. And so I think we're at a really interesting inflection point where there's three swim lanes that still need to coexist, and that the constant tension that our customers are feeling right now is, where do I start? What's a good use case from an AI point of view? How do I actually develop a scalable foundation? And I hope that we can shed some light on some of that today.
Perfect. All right. So what you're saying then is this issue isn't whether AI matters, it's just understanding where it belongs.
Agreed. Yeah, I think it amplifies human judgment. It does not replace it. And we see that with our teams day in and day out, working with some of our biggest customers and clients. And I think if finance leaders don't distinguish that boundary and a vision around that, there's tension that can be created within an organization across internal audit, IT, operational finance and accounting, et cetera, that is going to need to be relieved. And we think a more proactive approach to that is adequate and appropriate. And so I think, this conversation we're having right now as we set the stage for today is helpful, and we'll hit on it as we go through the rest of our conversation today.
Perfect. So let's move into our first topic, which talks about the financial steward to strategic CFO. I think the interesting thing about this topic, Michael, is that's something I've heard at least for the last 15 or 20 years. Like, this is not necessarily a new concept, right? When we talk about finance transformation, what is the whole point of going on a transformation project? It is, how do we go away from just keeping and recording the numbers to actually being a business partner to the finance function? So what we wanted to talk a little bit about today, and Michael, where I would like to get your opinion, is this concept of moving from financial steward to strategic CFO and what that looks like. Is that any different here in 2026?
Yeah, I think the mandate of CFO CAO hasn't changed a lot, where boards still want accurate reporting, they need reliable forecasting, strong controls have to exist, which ultimately balance efficiency, effectiveness, costs, risk, all those types of things. But I think the environment around it has shifted dramatically in the last 12 to 24 months with the kind of the injection of AI into the landscape. We think about, to your point on like 5 or 10 years ago, I think a lot of finance transformation under the office of CFO CAO was driven based on like ERP implementations, upgrades. I know some of that's going on still when we think about the SAP ecosystems and ECC to S4 upgrades, and RPA and ETL. And I think a lot of those are still, like I said before, ongoing. But when we think about AI and how it's starting to kind of inject itself into the finance and accounting functions, it's attacking what I would call or trying to attack historically deterministic processes, and it's meaningful and it has an opportunity to add a lot of value, but there's a ton of complexity that comes with it. And in my world, when we think about closing consolidation, we're really talking about things around surfacing anomalies when we look at journal entries and month-over-month postings, variance commentary, and kind of taking away, let's say, first draft or first cuts of that and allowing individuals to go and look and drive for better insight that actually bring more value to the business. And then proactively managing analytics when we think about a risk-based approach to journal postings, reconciliations, anything tied to period end close when we talk about workload reduction. But I think at the end of the day, the accountability is still there. So there's these great tools, but organizations and leaders are still accountable for making sure that those numbers are accurate and they're not moving in a way that is harmful to both the business and the streets. And so I think that when we look at technology and transformation, acceleration is great, but it doesn't necessarily reduce responsibility. And I think with that, it's actually raising the bar of performance for organizations, because with AI, you're kind of taking a reliance on this more of a set it and forget it type ecosystem, which inherently raises the bar around the controls required, the level of comfortability within the business that you need to attain, et cetera. And there's a lot of things that have to be done before you move down that path in order to get an organization comfortable and make sure that both internal and external audit are ready to move forward.
Well, that's certainly exciting. And as we look to the future, I think everyone's excited about that. But where does the CFO need to stay deeply involved in what they're doing today?
I think there's three areas that come to mind for me. I hit on this earlier, but trust in the financials first and foremost is mission critical. And when we think about organizations that have grown, have been highly acquisitive, have bolt-on ERPs, using consolidation tools, et cetera, there's an underlying bedrock or need for clear data definitions, harmonized chart of accounts, ownership of master data, and consistent architecture across the business that ultimately reduces the noise that exists. And when we think about how AI plays into that, I actually don't think that AI enforces governance. In fact, it amplifies the weakest components of it. And we'll talk about it a bit later, but I think AI actually has an opportunity to create chaos in environments where there isn't clear governance around data. That's typically where we urge organizations to start. The second, I think, is, finance and accounting leaders need to set a North Star, have a vision for, risk tolerance of the business based on where they're at today. Asking themselves questions like, where can we introduce probabilistic outputs, meaning, can I use estimates, rates, et cetera, to get to outputs that, are 90 to 95% accurate using those estimates? Where does our organization need to preserve our ability to make determinations? That idea of human in the loop and not just quote unquote outsourcing to technology. And I think that those boundaries and those decisions have to be led by the leaders of the organization. That vision has to be established. And then it has to be permeated through transformation programs that hit the different finance pillars. And we'll talk about some of those opportunities here later. And then the last, I believe, excuse me, that's critically important is how do you develop talent right now? There is so much changing today. And what we're seeing is that teams that can continuously adapt are actually typically at the forefront of adoption of some of these things. And when we think about factors impacting talent development, obviously we've talked about technology. There's a ton of regulatory complexity right now when you think about ESG, statutory requirements, e-invoicing requirements in Latin America and Europe, and then just general shifts in business models as we go forward that are driven by a largely acquisitive environment. And so at the end of the day, when CFOs are trying to cultivate a team, they can't be static. And I think some of the skills and capabilities that maybe set individuals up for success in the last 10 to 15 years are now kind of table stakes expectations, and that capability and that skill set is shifting. So when I talk with leaders, I think there's kind of two anecdotes that I like to use that ring true. You can automate tasks. You can't automate the curiosity of your people. And so having a workforce that's curious, wants to learn more, wants to understand is really impactful and powerful. Um, and that capability building is an offensive maneuver and a move. Meaning, if I start to build a talent pool and a workforce that actually has a baseline that can scale and move us into 2030s, 2040s, et cetera, I'm actually building a bigger team of constituents that can help us continue to evolve and grow as a business.
So if that's where CFOs and finance leaders need to stay deeply involved in, kind of what do they need to let go of, and what is the hardest to let go of?
I mean, the easy answer is stop reviewing everything and delegate and deploy your people in strategic positions. But I think there's probably I'd say 4 pointed areas that I have that are top of mind is the CFO and CAOs and finance leadership in general can't be a default escalation point. I think finance leadership tends to be what I'd call like the final arbiter um, of fringe or edge cases. And as we think about talent development, we need people who can make decisions, have trust by leadership, and can move the business in the right direction. And I think the target I would say is you want to try to get to a point where you can trust your systems and teams to resolve about 90% of issues without escalation. The second is owning all of the strategic insight and direction of the business personally, which kind of ties to the default escalation point, where if you look at high performing CFOs over the last 10 to 15 years, a lot of them have differentiated themselves by knowing every single thing that happens in the business. They understand the balance sheet and P&L at an excruciating level of detail, everything that's happening within the business. But with where we're moving from I'd say an analytics point of view, and we think about tools like RPA, ETL, Power BI, Tableau, et cetera, and then AI enabled insight, intelligence is becoming a lot, I would say, more readily available to practitioners who are really boots on the ground and executing or doing these activities. And so they now have I would say, an onus in having that strategic insight and actually moving real time on issues. And I think with going back to the talent development piece, designing a room that consistently produces smart answers is where CFOs need to go. Third would be, managing risk through this ongoing technology friction that exists today, whether that's AI, SaaS tools, et cetera. I think in the past, risk or risk mitigation was seen as a lever for slowing things down, which isn't necessarily the right choice. And that resulted in more approvals, more reviews, more manual checkpoints. I have a customer that has, I want to say, 5 to 6 levels of review on some of their journal entries that go in during the close period, which I found shocking. But I think that in a high performing environment, that you can balance speed and risk mitigation, and the way you do that is through architecture, having a strong foundation, and the way that you integrate non-finance based functions into transformation programs when we talk about IT, internal audit, external audit, et cetera. And then the last, and again, I've hit on talent a decent amount, but the blueprints of the past and holding on to the talent models that worked 10 years ago just really are not going to take your business forward here in the next 10 years, when the environment, particularly with AI, it seems to change on almost a monthly or quarterly basis at this point. And so adaptability is incredibly important, and holding on to things that worked and that being the way that you operate going into the future is just not going to get organizations there over the next 10 years.
Got it. Well, what I'd like to do now is kind of ask a similar question to our audience that's on the line here. So we're going to launch a poll question for those of you that are dialed in here. And what we want to ask your opinion on is what is going to demand the most attention from finance leadership in 2026? Do you think that's enterprise strategy and growth? Do you think that's modernizing process and technology, leading change, navigating risk, volatility, and resilience, or is it deploying AI? So we'll give people a few seconds here to submit their answers. All right, just 10 more seconds. Perfect. So hopefully you can see the results. As you can see on at least for my screen, number one that got the most vote share is modernizing finance process and technology. Number two is navigating risk, volatility, and resilience. And last is deploying AI agents, right? So that's sort of similar with our thinking, is that, deploying AI into unstructured process or deploying AI outside of sort of governed finance SaaS solutions is just going to lead to chaos pretty quickly, right? Certainly AI can be used as a knowledge management tool, large language models, but sort of deploying AI to do work, actual work over, unstandardized process, poor data, not governed in a way that reduces your risk, certainly wouldn't be a major priority for those in 2026. So I'm going to close the poll. It's a good transition into our next topic here. So Michael, as we look to 2026, if the priority isn't just to buy AI, what should finance leaders actually focus on?
Yeah, I think buy AI makes me laugh. Um, I think the view, just taking a step back on AI, needs to shift. I think a lot of people are viewing it as a technology. It's a skill set. It's a capability. Technology could vary over the next 10 years. So the sentiment of buying AI, I find funny. But I think the three key priorities, and you kind of hit on this earlier, Josh, is and the poll kind of illuminated the same thing, right? Is let's focus on building a foundation that we can scale against when we think about standardizing processes, strengthening governance, and sequencing acceleration, then intentionally. And at the end of the day, this creates discipline within the organization that is required for you to build, I mean, quite frankly, any type of automation solution on top of, whether that's, a SaaS driven model, RPA, AI, et cetera. I'd say these are fairly standard tenets that I'm sure the group on the line here has heard from practitioners over the years, and I don't think that shifts even with the advent of AI. And I think that what we've been hitting on so far is that AI continues to be an accelerant, and it can amplify whatever that foundation is, but it can amplify it in a north-facing great direction or a south-facing poor direction. And so I think focusing on these three things is critically important. And when we think about transformation and the work we do at customers, these are our bedrock of how we operate and what we think about, right? It's not just, hey, let me go plug in this solution, take process A from here, put process A over here, and hunky dory, we're good to go. And so I think this is important and part of what obviously we work with customers on, but any client or business that's on the line, you should be challenging your outside practitioners with thinking through and providing you perspective on, because it's critically important.
Perfect. Yeah, and that would echo my personal view as well, right? Like if you don't have a foundational technology layer that sort of governs your workflows, governs your rules, you can perform an audit trail look back analysis on. On top of that, if you don't have standardized process across the sites or across geographies, or standardize what data is coming into that tool, how that data is used, then everything else is just going to fall apart. Right. So I think when we think about 2026 and what the priorities are. Like the safest bet a CFO can make today is doing work to standardize process, getting a foundational technology layer in place, and then think about how AI could play within that. But certainly sequencing that in the other order would lead to a poor outcome. So that's going to take us into our second poll, which is related to the next topic around digital finance, automation, and AI, and where people are actually seeing ROI. So before I go into the Clearsulting point of view, we wanted to launch a poll and ask the audience and say, okay, where is your organization seeing actual ROI from digital finance initiatives, right? Is that from RPA or bots? Is that from finance SaaS solutions like a Blackline or a Workiva, Kyriba, Pigment, things like that? Is it from generative AI? Is it from agentic AI? Or are we still struggling to realize measurable ROI? So we'll give folks a minute to respond. All right, looks like the votes are slowing down. I'm going to end the poll in a second here. All right, I think that's everyone. Perfect. So in those poll results, what we saw was that not a lot of folks are seeing measurable ROI from a digital finance initiative. I've lost the results on my screen, but I think it was around 57% of the respondents voted we're not seeing a measurable ROI from a digital finance initiative. Second was like a finance SaaS solution, so like a Blackline, a Kyriba, Workiva, things like that. Third was RPA or bots. Yeah, there are the results there. And then just a handful of votes on the AI side. So I think those results are kind of interesting. First, we're struggling to realize measurable ROI was the first result, right? That's kind of interesting. I think that goes back to the priorities on the prior section, right? So if we're deploying a digital solution without sort of thinking through the process, the people, the adoption, things like that first, almost always those digital solutions are not going to deliver the results that we were thinking we were going to get. I think the other main takeaway here, and we're going to provide a perspective, is that AI is not delivering a ton of ROI for finance functions today. Now, of course, that might change, but that is, I would say, polar opposite to what I see on my LinkedIn feed. If I'm scrolling LinkedIn today, I'm seeing like I've completely automated my FP&A function with this agentic AI bot that I built in 3 minutes. And like if you're reading that, it's like post after post after post of people making these claims. And then I actually go on the ground and visit, some of my clients, go to their offices, hop on a call with them, and AI is like the last thing that we're talking about, right? So I think there's a sense of FOMO out there and versus what is actually happening on the ground. So I'm going to close the poll and we'll sort of talk through the Clearsulting perspective on this topic. So I'm going to ground everyone in sort of 3 activity groups, right? When it comes to finance, like what would we classify a finance activity as? The first one is human accountable. So these are activities that might be supported by automation or AI, but it needs to be performed by a human, given the risk or nature of that activity. Then we have rules-based automation. So this is a process that is deterministic, right? It executes predefined logic. It does not self-learn. It does not identify new patterns. It always does the if this, then that, right? Now, of course, you can update those rules, update those workflows, but it's a guaranteed sort of outcome based on what you've built. The next is AI or machine learning candidates. And so this is a machine-based system that infers from outputs or from inputs how to generate outputs. So that can be a prediction, it can be a content like a narrative or a summary, it can be a recommendation or potentially a decision, Obviously, when we're asking them to infer from inputs the output, that output might differ, and we also might not be able to backtest or prove to an auditor that it's a repeatable outcome. So those are the three main categories that we would like to ground you in before we sort of talk through these results. Now, what's included in each of these? So human accountable, those are things like final approvals, right? Making a decision on risk appetite. Like if you think about the close, like how often would I reconcile an account? A human is going to make that decision. Negotiations or M&A or professional judgment, things that we actually want somebody that's licensed to make a decision to make that decision. And then of course, sign-offs. In rules-based automation, that's things like workflow, that's things like matching rules, aggregating of data, calculations of data, applying a threshold, if below this threshold, do this, if above it, do that. And then anything that kind of follows that, if this, then that logic. And then under the AI or the machine learning candidates, things like knowledge management, like, hey, AI agent, tell me what's in my policy for this type of question or this type of situation. Tell me about some variance or root cause analysis, right? Tell me a little bit about what happened, right? Forecasting or predictions, reading unstructured inputs, things like maybe an invoice that comes in to your system or a remittance on the AR side. That's coming from many different providers following an unstructured process, right? So we can use AI to read that. And then of course, anomaly detection, right? I think we can agree the middle column, that's things where you do not expect anything to go wrong in the application of that category. Where in AI or machine learning, those are things where 100% perfect output is not necessarily what we need in that process. It's more speed to advice or recommendation or an insight. So we did something interesting as we prepared for this webinar. So one thing that we do at Clearsulting when we work on finance strategy engagements is we do a finance insight toolkit. So that looks across the entire finance function. I think there's across 500 activities across 20 major process areas. And we said, okay, for each of those activities in the future, what would remain human accountable? What's really a candidate for rules-based automation? And where can AI or machine learning really be used, right? And we got some interesting results. I'm going to flash the high level first and then walk you through some process by process insights. So I think the first thing, it kind of reflects that poll result we just had, and it's a complete counter narrative to everything that's sort of in the news, which is AI and machine learning probably is only going to help 20 to 30% of existing finance effort today. It's also going to do a lot of things that finance can't do today, right? So providing insights or detecting things that finance isn't doing. But in terms of what finance does today, AI or machine learning is really only going to help with 20 or 30% of existing effort. The huge bulk of what finance does today is based on rules, right? So that kind of automated with rules. And that technology has existed for quite some time now, right? So that's an insight that says, well, transformation or priorities or where investing in technology, of course, AI or machine learning is going to play a role, but almost on a 2-to-1 basis within finance specifically, we are still going to want to invest in rules-based automation over AI. And then, of course, 20 to 30% of what finance does today is always going to remain within a human accountable function. We wanted to dive into that a bit further and give you some interesting results as it goes by process. So what you're looking at on this slide is on the left is a effort basis, right? So if you assume sort of a finance function of around 100 people or 1,000 people, that most of that effort is in FP&A and reporting and record to report. And then we have order to cash, procure to pay, payroll, treasury, tax, etc. Right? So that shows you on an effort basis. The turquoise being AI candidates, the light blue being rules-based automation, and the dark blue being human accountable. On the right, instead of on an effort basis, is on a percentage basis of that process. And both graphs are sorted from most to least potential AI impact. So in both scenarios, as you might expect, FP&A will be the process that will benefit the most from AI or machine learning, almost on a 2-to-1 basis to the next best process, right? What's interesting is when you look at the left and the right graphs, record to report is the next from an effort basis because there's a ton of effort that goes into record to report activities. But on a percentage basis for that process, it actually ranks fourth, right? So when we look on the right-hand side, FP&A, order to cash, those are the areas that are going to benefit the most from AI or machine learning, followed by procure to pay, then into record to report. Treasury is going to benefit on the forecasting side, tax as well, and then payroll the least, right? And that sort of makes conceptual sense as well, right? When we get into record to report, treasury, tax, and payroll, those are things we don't want to be wrong on. Procure to pay, of course, we need to pay properly, but we might need some help on reading invoices that come into the organization. And then order to cash, there's a bit more fluidity, right? Cash application is not something that needs to be as accurate as a journal entry, right? So we can leverage AI a little bit more in order to cash. And then of course, FP&A is all forward looking, right? So when we're doing a forecast or variance analysis or reading an input, we can afford to be wrong a little bit more often than these other areas. So just to summarize the last two slides, rules-based automation is still the anchor of finance transformation, specifically within record to report. And then when we look at where AI or machine learning could actually play, it's going to be primarily in FP&A, followed by order to cash, procure to pay, and then record to report. So I'll take you to the next slide and just some examples of where AI is being applied in finance. You can read through these a little bit on your own time. I'm going to highlight a few as we go through each area. So the first on the FP&A side, some cool ways that AI is being applied, model explanation, right? So when something changes, you can ask AI, why did this number change? What driver and what data point in that driver actually contributed to a model changing? Or explain the formula, right? Like how is this number actually computed, and getting an explanation from AI on all the inputs and how that actually got computed. Planning suggestions, so AI can be used to say, well, based on your forecast or historical, what might your target be? And what threshold would we want to put in place where we would want to course correct? AI can also create scenarios for you, talking through like, what if this went up by 10% or this went down by 10%? What would be the impact to the P&L or the balance sheet? And what would you recommend to do based on all the drivers that we've set up? And then more recently, one of our partners, Pigment, actually in this quarter has released an AI agent that will actually build models for you, right? That's actually one of the things I've seen on LinkedIn is people saying, oh, I built this cool model in Excel. The tools that are out there are actually having that AI embedded in their system, so you can build models through AI within the control system of an FP&A tool. On the order to cash side, sort of the biggest lever that we would see would be on cash application, right? Remittance information might not be structured. It can suggest or match payments to invoices and learn from patterns, right? Of course, cash application isn't as critical as posting the actual journal entry. So we can afford to use AI a little bit more because we can always course correct or take suggestions. So that's the biggest lever we see on the order to cash side. Of course, on the procure to pay or source to pay side, invoice extraction and classification, right? So people send all kinds of different invoices into the AP department, having AI read those and then put those out in the standard data format we need for matching or classifying invoices between services or goods or things like that is where AI is having the biggest impact. And then because I've got Michael here on the line, he's our close and consolidation lead, I'm going to ask for his insights on the record to report side.
Yeah, I think record report is a really natural place where it plays. We're seeing it when we think about, you've highlighted these RUCs, manual journals, and variance analysis. Materially as it pertains to like exception identification and trying to understand where I'm seeing abnormalities in my processes today. The example I'll use is, imagine a world where instead of reviewing, let's say 1,000 recs and the corresponding items, your team's reviewing, let's say 80 that are the most material and matter the most, and you have a tool that's helping, highlight those, bring those to light, and you still have to sign off on them. So I think in record to report, it's really about like narrowing your focus and getting to decisions that actually have a material impact on the balance sheet and your P&L statement at the end of the day. I think, when we zoom out, Josh, from Record Report, we look at this from a holistic lens. Where AI is providing the most value is unstructured inputs, exception triage, narrative acceleration, pattern detection, kind of the things you hit on across all four of the pillars here. Um, and we're not seeing a ton of value in deterministic control sensitive areas yet. I will caveat, I think it's coming. But control environments need to get up to speed with where AI is at and what it can do. And the documentation of what AI is actually doing step by step is a critical component of getting um, auditors comfortable. And so I think with all of this, we talked about sequencing earlier, and it's a relevant spot to talk about how, if you do have unstable processes, AI will continue to surface chaos that exists in what's going on in your ecosystem the same way the humans doing those, bespoke different processes across regions typically does right now. And that inconsistent data is going to create problems at the end of the day. But if you have, strong governance controls and architecture in place, it has an opportunity to be an accelerant across the use cases that you've outlaid or laid out here. And so I'm excited. I think for us, it's a unique time as a firm that supports organizations in thinking through these things, because we have an opportunity, and I think we work with customers that sit on varying ends of the spectrum, and it's allowing us to bring insights from those that might be leaders and kind of build those or mold those into the transformation programs that we're helping deploy with our customers.
Perfect. So now we've talked a little bit about where AI is actually delivering value. Michael, I'd love your opinion on where should we be cautious when it comes to AI?
I think you have them laid out here. Environments that have really, really, really strict repeatability or require detailed audit evidence, like those they scare me right now, because there's deterministic control points in those processes for an explicit reason. When we think about journal entry approvals and workflows, revenue recognition decisions, SOX control execution, external reporting sign off, those will not go away. And they're not they're not looking at probabilities or forward looking deterministic calculations. And if you start to introduce any type of inference into this stuff, there's an opportunity that the data is wrong. So that's number one. Operating on weak data foundations, I hit on this earlier, but again, if your master data ownership is unclear, your chart of accounts isn't harmonized across acquired businesses as you think about your ERPs and your consolidation tools, and then if definitions differ when you think about master data as a whole, AI is not going to clean that up. Ad hoc or bolt-on AI deployments, we have a position that we think that technology that is built for governance and control have the best are the best ecosystem for AI deployment, because it creates forced governance around the tool and the platform, and there's standards that exist typically within those platforms that they're required or they're pushing their AI agents within the platform to adopt. And so what's interesting is when you think about like ad hoc or bolt-on deployments, I think about examples where end user exports data, they run an AI analysis on that data. In lieu of actually doing some type of journal entry analysis, they don't review it, approve it, et cetera. They copy paste that back into a form, a report, et cetera. But what's happening is there's what I would call shadow workflows popping up, where they've gone through these steps, but when they run that AI analysis, there's not actually an audit trail of here's the 25 things it explicitly did, the transformations that are done, et cetera. So when you think about, let's say, ad hoc or bolt-on tools like an RPA or an ETL, what's required a lot of times when those are deployed is like step by step, this is what's going to happen. Here's the flow of data throughout. You're getting your auditor comfortable with that, your internal control team. And so I think that creates inherent risk, and structured tools like SaaS create a control plane around those types of AI agents. And then I think as a whole, there's just been so much change in the finance accounting ecosystem over the past 10 years that we're seeing a lot of change fatigue in organizations. We have people who have gone through ERP implementations or upgrades, then rolled into shared service or BPO redesign, then rolled into SaaS deployment or RPA deployment or ETL deployment, now being rolled into AI pilots layered on top of it. And people get tired and I think resist a bit of like ambiguity and overload. And so when we go back to talking about how you lead change, which I know we're going to talk about here in a second, having a very clear, crystallized understanding of what the benefit is going to be for your people is so impactful because it gets them bought into what's coming. And so we're in our approach and how we work with customers, we're trying to be smarter about that. And I like the thought of like one step forward to go, or one step backwards to go 10 steps forward. Like, can you slow down to go fast? I think that's a really important mindset to have when you think about change fatigue and adoption of some of this stuff. Josh, I know I kind of segued into this. We're going to talk about leading, change as a finance leader. So far, we've talked about a little bit about architecture. We've talked about sequencing a bit. You gave a nice overview of where AI works. We've talked about where to be cautious. But from my point of view, and we talked on this with change fatigue, it doesn't matter unless the organization is brought along the way. And I think that the success of programs is actually more reliant on the leadership and the people helming those programs than it is on the fancy shiny tools or process changes that are supposed to come along with it. And so, I think people are nervous about where AI is going, how it's going to impact their business, what they do. And so how do you think, and how are you supporting, our customers with how to approach conversations with their teams about what the future of finance looks like, how it impacts their day-to-day and their responsibilities?
Yeah, perfect. I think where we need to start is recognize that the concern we hear in our personal lives and our professional lives are real. Like, people, I think, are more genuinely concerned about whether AI is going to take their job than every previous technical innovation that we've had in finance or more broadly in the professional world, right? So I think leaders need to recognize that concern is real and determine sort of a way to frame that in a way that removes all the noise that people might be getting from social media, LinkedIn feeds, conversations over coffee, things like that, and grounds it in reality, right? Which is sort of my second point here. The vision is still the same. It's just there's a little bit of a twist now, right? We're still doing everything that the finance function was trying to achieve 10, 15, 20 years ago of shifting from a bookkeeper, a steward, to a strategic business partner for the finance function. None of that has actually changed. It's just AI is now part of the picture. And there's two things to that. One is, when we look back at those statistics that I just shared, AI is somewhere between like a third to a quarter of potentially what finance is doing today, right? So the premise that AI is going to replace the finance function is quite simply, it's just wrong, right? And I think grounding them in like, well, here's exactly where AI can play a role. It can help with unstructured inputs. It can help make a recommendation. It can help make a prediction. But right now, it's not taking away the judgment, the decision making, the risk appetite, things like that, and as well as generating insights that we just don't deliver today as a finance function, right? So I think it's grounding sort of in reality about, well, what is AI actually going to do for us in the context of what finance needs to deliver overall, and that doesn't change the vision, right? Which sort of brings me to my last point, which is you have to surround your finance team with people that is bought into that vision, right? We've certainly all encountered individuals that love sort of that manual, mundane, take my invoice, enter it into a system, right? The fact that AI is here has not changed the ambition to remove that type of activity from the finance function, right? So of course we want to eliminate sort of data entry or tasks that do not require any sort of critical thinking, or just reconciling or correcting for mistakes through data misaggregations or things like that, right? So the vision hasn't changed. We want to build a team that's bought into that vision, because the methods of achieving that are going to change. Like whether that was ERPs in the 90s, SaaS tools, now it's AI, maybe it's going to be something different in 5 to 10 years, but the vision's still going to be there, right? So, of course, communicating, grounding people in reality, saying that the vision is still the same, but also making sure you've got a team that's bought into the vision and want to deliver that, and they're curious to deliver that, versus folks that might want to actually stay in the manual nature of the activity. That is not where the value of finance comes from. So I'd like to do our last poll now, bring the audience in. Based on what we've kind of discussed so far, what do you think the perception of AI is within your organization, and how it's going to impact the finance function? Do you think people have an accurate perception of AI? No. If no, are people overreacting? If no, are people underreacting? Or do you think people actually have a pragmatic view on how AI will be adopted in the finance function? So we'll give folks a minute to respond here. All right, I'm gonna end and share those results. So what did we see here in this poll, right? For the most part, it's somewhat even. We have about a third of the group saying yes, people are being pragmatic. And then, 2/3 of the groups are saying no, but it's kind of split between overreacting and underreacting. Most are saying people are underreacting, right? Which is interesting. I think that means that people aren't grasping what AI can do for them, and sort of grounding themselves in some of the examples that we talked through today, but also thinking through, okay, if we actually fix that foundation, if we get our process standardized, if we get our workflows correct, if we get our data in the right spot, I think that's saying people are still not quite sure what AI can do with that, and we need to start educating them now on that so people get ready for it and plan for it, even if we're not making those changes today. All right, so one last topic. We'll go through some quick lessons learned, Michael, from prior projects, and then we'll close with some closing remarks.
Yeah, I think when we think about kind of lessons learned, Josh, I know we've hit on some of these already, so I'll probably focus on the ones that are more net new, but AI is not fixing data problems. And it will continue to make, I'd say, data quality issues more painful. You're layering on a layer of intelligent machine, let's call it, that's going to try to help you get to better end state products and highlight things that matter. And if it's using bad data in, bad data out, right, the age old adage, that'll continue to exist as we move forward. We talked about change fatigue a bit. And again, I think that what I re-emphasize there is that we have to be explicit about what to expect and the benefits and the impact to individuals, or human nature is we'll fill the blank space with our own assumptions, and you lose control of the narrative. And I think that with that, transformation as a whole needs to feel progressive. It needs to be, I like to use Legos, right? Each block adds to itself. It continues to grow. It continues to grow, and people need to have an understanding of how they're going to get there. When we think about AI in deployment within business, we're seeing a lot of pilots right now, and yes, those pilots are, let's say, technically working, but they get out of the build of that pilot and they had no defined operational owner. There's no governance model around it. There's no clear accountability for making sure it's continuing to do what it was anticipated to do. And then more importantly, there's not typically alignment in those pilots with non-finance functions to make sure that the infrastructure behind the tool and the governance and controls around the tool are maintained. And so, yeah, there's a pilot. 6 months later, it may still be going, but it's not getting scaled. It's not being sunset, just kind of lingers and exists. And I think in reality, that pilot is kind of more of a demonstration of capability than it is an actual tool that is being used or is useful for the business. And then the last, and you hit on this, Josh, is, expecting ROI without process redesign is one of the biggest issues and shortcomings that we see. If you want immediate ROI, there are process changes that have to happen as a component of transformation. That does not go away in the future. And the tool may be doing what it's intended to do, but if the process still can be the problem and it's still not getting you to maximize the benefit and the value there. And then I think the last thing, and the poll kind of hit on this, is it might have been the last poll or the one before, there's an expectation of ROI, but how are we measuring that from the jump? And I think that's where establishing the vision comes in. And I think, looking at, myself and how we've worked with organizations here at Clearsulting, we've grown in that dimension too. I think what we're trying to do is take more of an outcome-driven approach to say, let's take a step back before we go anywhere, and let's talk about what we're trying to get to. Let's talk about the quantitative benefits and drivers. Let's talk about the qualitative benefits and drivers. That's our North Star. Now, what do we need to do to get to that North Star? And I think that's often missed when we're trying to operate with speed and continue to show how we're bringing benefit to grow bottom line. And that can't be, I'd say, emphasized more. So it's an exciting time. I think there's a lot of fundamental transformation strategy that still holds true kind of here in the forward-looking world. But I'm excited to help our customers with it. I think it's fun. Like it's such an experimental phase right now. And I hope that, the group on the line here got something out of today.
Perfect. So just to conclude, before the top of the hour here, the CFO of 2026 is not the chief AI officer, right? And when we would say, what is the playbook for 2026? Number one, the best investment you can make in 2026 is to standardize process, standardize workflows, and get good, clean data sources before you accelerate. The second priority is distinguish that deterministic automation from probabilistic inference, or simply rules-based automation from AI. As we saw, the vast majority of transformation within finance is going to come from rules-based automation. So if you're starting AI before you've exhausted rules-based automation, you're likely in the wrong spot. And then third, invest in the solutions that are developing or embedding AI directly in their controlled platform, right? So when we define a controlled process with controlled workflow, with controlled thresholds, controlled data sources, that's the AI that audit is going to be okay with and that we can be comfortable with versus those bolt-on solutions. So standardize the process. The traditional rules-based automation is still where you should focus, and then make sure you've got an AI vision and you're investing in solutions that are going to embed AI directly in their platform. So thanks everyone. Thanks Mike for the conversation today, and have a great rest of your day. Thank you.